The dusty Wyoming wind of 1876 whistled through the canvas flaps of Professor Phineas Fancy's peculiarities. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of sawdust, sweat, and something vaguely sweet that tried to cover the scent of unwashed bodies. Tonight, like every night, the main attraction was Alara. She stood on a small, raised platform, a towering figure against the dimly lit tent. Her head nearly brushed the canvas ceiling, making the rough fabric sway with her slightest movement. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. Little children, wide-eyed and clinging to their parents' legs, pointed stubby fingers. Grown-ups whispered behind cupped hands. "Look at her size," someone muttered. Another chimed in. "She must eat a horse for breakfast." Alara heard it all, the rude comments, the frightened squeals, the awed murmurs. She always heard it. It was a familiar song, played night after night. She wore a long, dark dress, simple and sturdy, but it couldn't hide her height. Her hair, a deep brown, was pulled back in a tight braid, adding to her imposing presence. Her eyes, however, held a quiet sadness, a depth that most people were too busy staring at her height to notice. They saw a spectacle, a wonder, a freak. They didn't see Alara, the woman. A barker, Professor Fancy himself, with a loud voice and a twirly mustache, pranced around the platform. He spun tales of Alara's magical growth, exaggerating her past, painting her as something less than human. He used a long stick to point at her, as if she were a lifeless exhibit in a museum. Alara stood still, unmoving, her gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the tent walls, beyond the crowd, beyond Wyoming. She had learned long ago that the less she reacted, the sooner the show would end. She was simply waiting for the silence, for the moment she could step off the platform and disappear into the back of the tent, if only for a few hours before the next performance began. Among the gawking faces, one man stood out. Caleb wasn't shouting or pointing. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his hat pulled low, but his eyes were fixed on Alara. His face told a story of its own, lines carved by sun and hardship, and a jagged scar that ran from his temple down his cheek, a stark reminder of the war he had fought. The scar made people look away, but Caleb looked straight ahead, seeing not just Alara's height, but the quiet sorrow in her gaze. A heavy feeling settled in Caleb's chest as he watched Professor Fancy jab his stick toward Alara. It wasn't just anger, but a deep, familiar ache. He had seen enough cruelty in his life, too much of it during the long, bloody years of the Civil War. The way men treated each other, the way they treated those who were different, it had left a mark on his soul even deeper than the one on his face. This show, with its loud taunts and whispered judgments, brought it all back. He saw the way Alara stood, so still and proud, yet so vulnerable. He imagined the endless days, the endless nights, the endless stares. It wasn't right. No living creature deserved to be paraded around like a curiosity, stripped of their dignity. He felt a fire begin to burn within him, a quiet but firm resolve. He had come to town for supplies, but now a different purpose had taken hold. He couldn't just walk away and leave her to this life. Caleb pushed through the thinning crowd, his boots crunching on the sawdust. He ignored the stares he got for his own appearance, his mind set on one thing. He needed to speak to Professor Fancy. He didn't know what he would say, or what he could even do, but he knew he had to try. He wouldn't stand by and watch this unkindness continue. His heart, heavy with the weight of past sorrows, urged him forward. Caleb found Professor Fancy backstage, counting coins under a flickering lantern. The showman, still wearing his grand, if slightly dusty, coat, looked up with a frown as Caleb approached. "Can I help you, friend?" Professor Fancy asked, his voice losing its booming showman's quality and becoming sharp and wary. He eyed Caleb's scarred face and worn clothes with suspicion. "I wish to speak about your tall woman," Caleb said, his voice low but clear. He didn't raise it, nor did he look away from the professor's gaze. There was no anger in his tone, just a quiet seriousness. Professor Fancy chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Ah, Alara, a magnificent specimen, isn't she? The finest giantess in the West." But she's not for sale, my good man. She's under contract, a long and profitable one. He puffed out his chest, clearly proud of his prize. I understand she has a contract, Caleb replied, his gaze unwavering. I'm offering to buy it. Silence fell, thick and sudden. Professor Fancy's jaw dropped, and the few stagehands nearby, who had been lazily packing away props, froze. They turned to stare at Caleb, then at Alara, who had just stepped down from her platform and was watching from a distance, her expression unreadable. No one had ever tried to buy a performer's contract before, especially not one like Alara's. Buy her contract? Professor Fancy finally sputtered, regaining his voice. Are you mad, fellow? What would a man like you do with a giantess? She's not a farm animal. He laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. Caleb simply reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He untied the string and poured a surprising amount of gold coins onto the professor's table. The coins glinted in the lantern light, a silent, powerful argument. The showman's eyes widened, greed battling with disbelief. This is more than fair for the remainder of her agreement, Caleb stated, his voice still gentle, but firm as stone. His demeanor, serious and respectful, was the biggest surprise of all. He wasn't a drunken lout or a cruel master. He was just a quiet man with a clear purpose. Alara watched from shadowy corner as the professor's eyes gleamed at the sight of Caleb's gold. She'd seen that look before. It was the look of a man who saw profit, not people. She knew, deep in her weary bones, that she was merely a thing to be bought and sold. It didn't matter if it was a contract for a year or a lifetime. She was still someone else's property. When Professor Fancy finally agreed, his voice a little too eager, Alara felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. Another change, another owner. She had learned not to hope for kindness, only to brace for the next disappointment. She had been passed from one hand to another for so long that the idea of true freedom was like a forgotten dream. Caleb turned to her, his scarred face serious. Come, Alara, he said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. It was the first time anyone had spoken her name with such care in years. But even that small kindness didn't truly touch her. She was too used to tricks, to smiles that hid cruel intentions. She gathered her few belongings, a thin blanket, a worn brush, and a small, smooth stone she kept for comfort. As she walked past Professor Fancy, he didn't even meet her eye, already counting his new riches. Alara felt no sadness leaving the show, only a profound weariness. This new man, Caleb, seemed different, yes. He didn't yell or boast. But in her experience, different often just meant a new kind of hard. As they stepped out of the noisy tent and into the cool night air, Alara felt a mix of fear and resignation. Where was he taking her? What new demands would he make? She had been a spectacle, a worker, a burden. She expected nothing more from this new arrangement. Her shoulders slumped, and she walked beside Caleb, a giant shadow moving into an unknown future, believing she was simply traded from one master to another. The journey began in silence. Caleb led a sturdy horse pulling a small wagon, and Alara walked beside it, her long strides easily keeping pace. The lights of the town faded behind them, replaced by the vast, star-dusted sky of the Wyoming plains. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft thud of their footsteps on the dusty road. Alara kept her gaze straight ahead, expecting Caleb to eventually give her orders, to lay out the rules of her new servitude. After some time, with the moon high above, Caleb stopped the wagon. He turned to Alara, his scarred face softened by the pale moonlight. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Alara's heart sank. Here was, she thought, the new contract, the list of duties, the terms of her new bondage. She braced herself for the words. But Caleb didn't speak of chores or rules. He simply held out the paper to her. This is for you, Alara, he said, his voice gentle, almost hesitant. She took it, her large fingers trembling slightly as they touched the rough paper. It felt light, nothing like the heavy chain she felt around her spirit. She looked at him, then at the paper, confused. It's your freedom, Caleb explained softly, seeing the question in her eyes. It says you're free. You don't belong to anyone. Not to me. Not to Professor Fancy. Not to anyone. You're your own person now. Alara stared at the paper, then at Caleb, then back at the paper. The words swirled in her mind. Your freedom. She couldn't read, but the meaning of his words struck her with the force of a thunderclap. Freedom? Her own person? It was a concept so foreign, so unbelievable, that she couldn't speak. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She was utterly speechless, her mind struggling to grasp a truth she had never dared to dream. The dusty road stretched before them, but suddenly it felt like the path to an entirely new world. The paper felt strangely light in Alara's hand, almost like nothing at all. Yet, Caleb's words, "It's your freedom," weighed more than any chain she had ever known. She had spent her entire life under someone's thumb. As a child, her family had been poor, and her unusual height quickly made her a target for those seeking to profit. From one carnival to another, from one showman to the next, her days had been filled with commands, expectations, and the constant awareness that she was not her own. Now, Caleb said she was free, but what did that even mean? Her mind felt like a tangled ball of yarn, unable to find an end. If no one was telling her what to do, then what should she do? Should she walk away? Where would she go? She knew no other life, no other skills beyond standing still and enduring stares. The vast, open plains suddenly felt not like freedom, but like a terrifying emptiness. She looked at Caleb, a silent question in her sad eyes. He understood. You don't have to decide anything right now, Alara, he said, his voice as calm as the night air. You can come with me to my homestead. Rest. Think. You can stay as long as you like, or leave when you feel ready. It's your choice. A choice. The word felt foreign on her tongue, even in her thoughts. She had never truly made a choice about her own life. Even the clothes she wore, the food she ate, the places she went, all had been decided for her. This new idea of being in charge of herself was overwhelming. A faint ripple of fear ran through her. Was this a trick? Was he testing her? She couldn't imagine anyone truly giving something so precious without wanting something in return. Alara clutched the paper tighter, its edges pressing into her palm. She walked on beside Caleb, but her steps felt different now. Less resigned, more uncertain. The concept of freedom, a gift she never asked for, was heavier than any burden she had carried before. It was a blank page, and she didn't know how to write on it. As the first streaks of dawn painted the sky, a small, humble farmhouse appeared on the horizon. It was a simple log cabin, with a stone chimney and a small porch, surrounded by a few weathered-out buildings and a patch of dusty, tilled earth. This was Caleb's homestead, a quiet corner of Wyoming far from the bustle and cruel eyes of the traveling show. Caleb stopped the wagon near the cabin. He looked at Alara, whose face was still a mask of confusion and wariness. "This is it," he said, gesturing to the small farm. "It's not much, but it's mine. And for now, it can be yours too, if you wish." He dismounted and led the horse to a small stable, then returned to Alara. "There's a cot inside, and food," he explained, his voice calm and steady. "You are welcome to stay here, Alara. You can rest, eat, and simply be. There are no rules, no shows, no demands." Alara scanned the small property. It was nothing like the grand, glittering tent she was used to, nor the cramped, dirty quarters behind them. It was plain, simple, and utterly quiet. A sense of peace, faint but real, seemed to cling to the air around the little house. But still, the question of why hung heavy in her mind. Caleb seemed to read her thoughts. "I hope you can find some peace here, Alara," he said, his gaze meeting hers, clear and honest. "You deserve it. After all you've been through, everyone deserves a place where they can just be themselves, without judgment." He paused, then added, "If you decide to leave, the world is wide open to you. But for as long as you need it, this place is safe." He didn't press her, didn't demand an answer. He simply opened the cabin door and stepped aside, letting her choose whether to enter. It was another moment of profound choice, a feeling both liberating and terrifying for Alara. She looked at the small, inviting doorway, then at the endless horizon. The freedom felt like a heavy cloak, but the peace Caleb offered was a soft whisper. Slowly, hesitantly, she stepped towards the cabin. Days turned into weeks at Caleb's homestead. Alara moved quietly, like a gentle giant. She spent much of her time observing Caleb as he went about his daily chores. He never ordered her, never even hinted at what she should do. He simply worked, fixing fences, feeding the chickens, and tending a small patch of corn. His respect was a silent presence, unfamiliar yet comforting. One morning, Alara saw him struggling to lift a heavy bucket of water from the well. Without a word, she stepped forward and easily hoisted the bucket, carrying it to the small garden patch. Caleb paused, surprised, then offered a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Alara," he said. "That's a big help." From that day, a quiet rhythm began to form. Alara started helping more. She had never touched soil before, but now she knelt among the small green plants, carefully pulling weeds. Her large hands, once only used for display, learned to be gentle with fragile sprouts. Caleb showed her how to loosen the earth and how much water each plant needed. She found a quiet satisfaction in seeing the garden flourish under her care. The animals were a new wonder. The chickens, at first skittish of her towering height, soon grew used to her calm presence. She learned to scatter feed and collect eggs, her fingers surprisingly delicate as she handled the warm, fragile shells. There was a sturdy old mule that Caleb used for plowing, and Alara found herself talking to it softly as she helped brush its coat. These were tasks she never imagined doing, so far removed from the bright lights and harsh stares of the show. There were no audiences here, no one to judge her size. Only the sun, the soil, and the soft sounds of the farm. Each small task she learned, each blade of grass she tended, felt like a tiny step towards understanding what it meant to be truly free, to build something with her own hands, not just be displayed. As Alara found her rhythm on the homestead, Caleb watched her, learning too. He saw how she carried herself with a quiet dignity, even after years of being mocked and stared at. Her strength wasn't just in her tall frame, but in her spirit. She had endured so much, yet she never complained. She simply kept moving forward, taking in the world around her with a patient, observant gaze. Caleb had carried his own heavy burdens from the war. The images of battle, the cries of pain, the senseless loss of life. These had hardened parts of his heart. He had built walls around himself, finding comfort in the solitude of his small farm. He believed he was gentle, but the war had taught him to be wary, to expect the worst from people. But Alara's presence slowly chipped away at those walls. He saw the way she carefully tended a wilting flower, or how she spoke in soft murmurs to the shyest hen. He noticed the quiet joy in her eyes when a tiny sprout pushed through the soil. Her patience was a lesson to him. He realized that true strength wasn't just about fighting, but about enduring, nurturing, and finding beauty in small things. Her simple gratitude for a warm meal or a dry place to sleep touched him deeply. He saw her beginning to trust, a slow, delicate unfolding like a desert bloom after rain. This trust, earned through quiet respect and shared labor, began to soften the hard edges around his own heart. He found himself speaking more, sharing small observations about the weather or the crops. He even caught himself humming sometimes, a tune he hadn't hummed since before the war. Caleb had wanted to save Alara from cruelty, but in a way, she was saving him too. Her quiet resilience, her slow blooming into a life of peace, reminded him that gentleness was not weakness. It was a powerful force that could heal old wounds and build new futures, even for a scarred veteran in the vast, unforgiving Wyoming landscape. The small cabin often fell silent during meals. Caleb would prepare simple fare, stew, bread, coffee, and they would sit across from each other at the rough-hewn table. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the clinking of spoons, and the soft Wyoming wind outside. Alara, used to eating quickly and alone, often watched Caleb, trying to understand this man who had given her freedom. He never rushed her. He never pushed her to speak. Instead, he would offer her the warmest bread or make sure her cup was full. Small things, but to Alara, they were huge. One evening, he noticed she was looking at a book he had left on the table. Without a word, he opened it to a page with a colorful picture of a bird, pointing to it gently. He didn't try to teach her to read, just shared a small moment of quiet understanding. Alara, in turn, began to offer her own small kindnesses. She would set the table before Caleb came in from the fields, or make sure the fire was banked for the night. One cold morning, she noticed his coat was torn and, with surprising skill, she mended it, leaving it folded on his chair. When he put it on, he nodded his thanks, a faint smile touching his scarred lips. These quiet acts, more than any words, began to build a bridge between them. Trust, a fragile thing, started to take root. Alara saw that Caleb's gentleness was real, not a trick. He respected her space, her silence, her choices. He saw her, not just her height. And Caleb saw in Alara a deep well of quiet strength, a soul yearning for peace. There are no grand declarations, no lengthy talks about their pasts. Their understanding grew in the shared warmth of the cabin, in the unspoken comfort of knowing someone else was there, someone who truly cared. The meals remained mostly quiet, but the silence was no longer heavy with uncertainty. It was filled with the soft hum of two souls slowly, gently, becoming accustomed to each other's presence. One evening, as the shadows grew long and the fire cast dancing patterns on the cabin walls, Alara found her voice in a way she hadn't in years. Caleb was whittling a small bird from a piece of wood, his scarred hands moving with surprising grace. The air was calm, safe. "I remember a creek," Alara began, her voice a little rusty from disuse, but steady. Caleb stopped whittling, his eyes looking at her kindly. Before the shows, my village was by a creek. It was cold, but clear." She paused, as if gathering the fragile threads of memory. "My mother would let me go down there sometimes, to look for smooth stones, like this one." She pulled the small, smooth stone from her pocket, the one she'd carried all these years. The water was so clean you could see the fish. Small, fast fish. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "I was a big child, even then. My brothers would tease me, say I would scare the fish away. But I never did. I would sit by the bank, very still, and watch them." Her gaze drifted to the flickering flames, seeing not the fire, but the sunlit water of her childhood creek. "I like being still, just watching." Caleb listened, his whittling forgotten. He saw not the towering woman before him, but a small, large-boned girl, finding joy in the simple beauty of nature. He imagined her by that creek, quiet and observant, a world away from the harsh lights and mocking crowds. It was a glimpse into a lost innocence, a quiet spirit that had been buried under years of display and exploitation. "Sometimes," Alara continued, her voice softer now, "I would pretend I was a giant tree, rooted to the ground, strong, watching everything, but nobody could move me." She looked at Caleb, a flicker of something raw and honest in her eyes. "That's how I felt, mostly. A tree." The story was short, simple, but it opened a window into her soul. It showed Caleb the gentle heart that beat within her, a heart that longed for stillness and the quiet beauty of the world, long before the world decided she was merely a spectacle. Alara's story about the creek hung in the air, a delicate thread connecting their quiet lives. Caleb put down his whittling. He looked at the fire, then at his scarred hands, and finally at Alara. Her honesty had opened a door, and he felt a pull to walk through it, to offer a piece of his own past. "I saw too much of it," Caleb began, his voice rougher than Alara's, tinged with old sorrow. "In the war. Cruelty, I mean. Men doing terrible things to other men, to animals, to the land itself." He traced the scar on his cheek with a finger. "This is just one mark. The others, they're inside." He paused, remembering the screams, the smoke, the senseless destruction. "When I came back, I couldn't bear it anymore. The yelling, the fighting, the unkindness. It just stuck to me, like mud." He shook his head slowly. "I wanted to find a place where I could just be quiet. where I could try to mend some of the things I saw broken. Alara listened, her eyes fixed on his face. She saw the pain there, the deep sadness that echoed her own. She understood the weight of things seen, of things done. That's why, Caleb continued, meeting her gaze, when I saw you there in that tent. It was like seeing it all again. Someone being used, being hurt, just because they were different. And I just couldn't stand it. Not anymore. I had to do something. He looked around the small cabin, at the simple, hard-won piece they had built together. I don't want anything grand, Alara. Just a gentle life. A place where things can grow, where kindness is the rule, not the exception. He smiled, a rare, soft smile that reached his eyes. A place where a quiet woman can sit by a creek, if she wishes, and just watch the fish. His words painted a clear picture of his heart, a heart scarred but not broken, a heart that longed for a world free of the very cruelty he had rescued her from. It was an unspoken promise, a shared hope for a better, kinder way of living. With their stories shared and a deeper understanding blooming between them, Alara and Caleb began to look at the little cabin differently. It was more than just a place to sleep. It was a canvas for their shared hope for a gentle life. The farmhouse was old and simple, and it needed work. But now they would work on it together. Alara's great height, once a source of shame and spectacle, became a practical advantage. She could reach the high rafters to clear cobwebs and dust, and her strength made light work of moving heavy furniture. Caleb showed her how to mix plaster to patch cracks in the walls, and how to sand down the rough edges of the wooden table. He taught her how to repair a leaky roof, and she, in turn, found a quiet satisfaction in seeing things made whole again. They worked side by side, sometimes in comfortable silence, sometimes with soft murmurs about the task at hand. Caleb built new, sturdier shelves for the kitchen, and Alara helped him paint them a soft blue with paint he had traded for. She learned to hang curtains at the windows, letting in more light than the cabin had ever seen. The small garden expanded, and they built a small fence around it to keep out hungry critters. Each nail hammered, each board replaced, each coat of paint applied, felt like a step towards building not just a house, but a home. For Caleb, it was the first time his homestead felt truly shared, truly lived in. For Alara, who had only known temporary quarters and impersonal spaces, it was the first time she had a place that felt like her own, a place she was helping to create. They filled the cabin with simple comforts, a warm quilt Alara sewed, wildflowers she picked from the fields, and the scent of fresh bread baked in their newly mended oven. The old farmhouse, once just a shelter, began to hum with life and warmth, reflecting the quiet gentleness growing between them. It was becoming a true home, a sanctuary for two souls who had found healing and purpose in each other's company. As the Wyoming seasons turned, painting the plains in shades of green, gold, and then white, Alara and Caleb settled into a life woven with quiet comfort and shared happiness. Spring brought new life to the garden, which Alara tended with dedicated hands, marveling at each new sprout. Summer saw them working under the vast, blue sky, harvesting their small crops and mending fences that the harsh winter had worn down. Autumn brought cool winds and the rich smell of burning leaves, and they would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunsets that stretched across the horizon like spilled paint. Winter, with its deep snows, kept them mostly inside the cozy cabin, where the fire crackled warmly and the scent of fresh-baked bread filled the air. Alara, no longer just a spectator in her own life, found joy in knitting warm blankets and reading the few books Caleb owned, slowly learning the words with his patient help. They learned to lean on each other, not out of need for an owner or a servant, but as two partners building a life. Alara found her voice growing stronger, sharing her thoughts, and even a rare, soft laugh. Caleb's scars seemed less a mark of past pain and more a part of the man who had found peace. He no longer felt the old wariness, replaced by a deep, steady trust in Alara. Their future stretched before them, not a grand or famous one, but a gentle one. They were two souls, once broken and alone, now mended and connected by shared kindness. On the vast, open plains of Wyoming, far from the judging eyes of the world, Alara and Caleb had built more than a homestead. They had built a home for their hearts, a quiet sanctuary where gentleness was the foundation and happiness grew like the wildflowers in their fields. Their story was a testament to the simple, profound power of a kind heart and the enduring strength of the human spirit.